Hello. We now turn to the third stage of Baha'i expansion, which I have dated from the start of Shoghi Effendi's 10-year crusade, a comprehensive global campaign which he initiated in 1953. It was only from the 1950s onwards that the Baha'i faith has begun to fulfill the vision of its founders and become a genuinely world religion, albeit still small in scale. During the period since the 1890s, the Baha'i movement had achieved an impressive global diffusion, but the total number of Baha'is remained tiny, and the only substantial Baha'i communities were those of Iran and the United States. During this period of global expansion from the 1950s onwards, however, the total number of Baha'is in the world increased from perhaps 200,000 or so to about 5 million by the early 1990s. At the same time, many national Baha'i communities, apart from those of Iran and the United States, became quite large, with significant numbers of followers, and in several places, notably some of the Pacific Island nations, have come to form a significant component of the wider population. More generally, many national Baha'i communities have become more widely diffused within their own societies, and in many areas strong local roots have been put down, the Baha'is coming to form an integral part of the environing culture rather than some exotic presence. The social composition of many Baha'i communities has also radically changed. In 1950, outside of Iran, most Baha'is were drawn from the educated and middle classes, even in countries such as those of Latin America, where such social groups were a tiny minority. Now the majority of Baha'is in the world appear to be drawn from the rural and to a lesser extent urban masses in the third world of Baha'i expansion, that is Latin America, the Caribbean, Sub-Saharan Africa and Monsoon Asia. Even the North American Baha'i communities now comprise people with a much wider range of social backgrounds, including large numbers of ethnic minority group members. Again, the cultural diversity of the Baha'is is now much greater, in terms both of the number of ethnic groups represented within the movement and the range of cultural expressions of being Baha'i. There is no longer the dominance of Iranian or Western cultural styles, which characterized earlier stages in the development of the faith. This transformational expansion has reflected a fundamental shift in the focus of Baha'i teaching work. Thus, whilst up to the 1950s, Baha'is commonly concentrated their attention on urban, educated audiences, often utilizing newspaper publicity and public meetings as a major part of their activities, in much of the world they have since adopted so-called mass teaching methods, learning to teach large numbers of often illiterate peoples directly and making much greater use of music. Significant contacts with rural populations in several parts of the Third World began during the 10-year crusade, notably in Uganda, Bolivia, the Mentawai Islands of Indonesia, and the Malwa area of India, and have subsequently been expanded to many other countries, often with the same results, the influx of hundreds or even thousands of new Baha'is. Although sometimes placing severe logistical strains on the local and national Baha'i administrations involved, increasing experience has led to the use of more effective methods of integrating the new Baha'is into the community and of deepening their knowledge and commitment to the faith. The large-scale influx of new Baha'is, often poorly educated, lacking in material means and remote from the main centers of population, has prompted the development of new means of communication within the Baha'i communities involved, including teaching institutes and Baha'i radio stations, as well as an increasing concern with socio-cultural development, including literacy programs, schooling, self-help rural development schemes, and the promotion of indigenous cultural activities. Since 1953, Baha'i expansion has been channeled by a series of global plans. First, Shoghi Effendi's 10-year crusade, up to 1963, and then a succession of plans directed by the Universal House of Justice from 1964 onwards. One major focus of these plans has been administrative expansion. Thus, whilst in 1953 there had only been 12 national Baha'i councils in the world, by 2006 this number had risen to 165. Meanwhile, the number of local councils had risen from 670 to almost 10,000. As to overall global distribution, whilst in 1952 there had been Baha'is in some 116 countries and major colonial territories worldwide, this had increased to 191 countries and 46 dependent territories by 2006. My understanding is that North Korea is now the only country in the world in which there are no Baha'is, apart from the Vatican City-State. In terms of localities where Baha'is reside, these have increased from some 27,000 in 1953 to over 100,000 by 2006. Since 1953, certain aspects of change within the Baha'i community have been increasingly emphasized, notably the establishment of Baha'i schools, the promotion of socio-economic development projects, particularly literacy and primary health care, the enhanced role of women and youth, and the promotion of a system of comprehensive institutes aimed at individual and community development. The schools and development projects both indicate the increasingly well-established nature of particular Baha'i communities, and as normally they are made available to non-Baha'is as well as to Baha'is, have an impact on the wider societies of which these communities form part. Although not designed as a means of propagating the faith, they have often had that effect. The emphasis on the role of women has been particularly important, having both caused Baha'is to think more deeply about the role of women in Baha'i administration and community life, of major significance in those societies in which male domination has been taken for granted, and also increased the number of those actively involved in Baha'i teaching work. Again, it has helped promote a stronger familiarization of Baha'i communities and hence more effective socialization of Baha'i children. Meanwhile, the enhanced role of youth from the 1960s onwards gave young people, with their abundant energy and relative freedom from constraining social ties, a leading role in Baha'i activity, particularly the teaching work. It also had a major impact on Baha'i cultural styles, as with a much greater emphasis that came to be given to music in Western Baha'i communities. Reviewing the overall expansion of the Baha'i religion, we can see that the periods of expansion were also closely linked to changes in the overall distribution and composition of the Baha'i community worldwide. Thus, up until the early 1890s, almost all Baha'is were Iranians and living in what might be termed the religion's Islamic heartland: Iran, the Middle East, Egypt, the Caucasus, and Central Asia. Then, between the 1890s and 1950s, a small but significant minority of Westerners became Baha'is, coming to play a disproportionate role in the further geographical expansion of the faith, as well as in its administration and public presentation. Only since the 1950s has the Baha'i faith succeeded in attracting large numbers from its third world, these Baha'is now constituting the majority of the global Baha'i population. It is not possible to give precise figures for these changes, but in a series of very rough estimates made by Moojan, Momen and myself in a 1989 article in the journal Religion, I'll give the reference in the notes below, we suggested that in the early 1950s, over 90% of the Baha'is worldwide lived in Iran, less than 5% in the West, that is, North America, Europe, and the Anglo-Pacific, and less than 2% in the whole of the Baha'i Third World, that is, South and Southeast Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean, and Oceania. By contrast, we suggested that by the late 1980s, Middle Eastern and Western Baha'is probably constituted respectively less than 7 and 5% of the world's total, and the rest of the world almost 90%. A similar picture of distributional change emerges from calculations of the number of local spiritual assemblies and of localities in which Baha'is reside. I will go into the details of these differences in a future series of videos. The next and final video in this set is on the concept of geocultural breakthroughs. Thank you for listening.